Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm an environmental geology major, junior, Sarah, as was stated. And for most of you who were here for Allie's presentation, I also participated in a semester-long project with Sue Swanson and Allie working on Esri maps. And also awarded the Venture and International Education Grant to go to Victoria, Australia, which if you don't know in the context of where it is in Australia, it's the southernmost state and also the smallest and most densely populated. So we were around the Melbourne area for most of the trip. I chose the map journal template because it gives you a little bit more room for writing paragraphs and also the photos and also the map. You get to view all three and the photos are easily expandable. So for the 7 points I had, this was the template that ended up working the best. And all of my points were national parks or national sites, towns, and I think that covers it. So I chose to look at bushfires because I've seen the damage both in Australia when I lived there as a child and also in the US. Growing up in Australia, you learn that the mentality is always be really conscious on the water that you're using and also to be cautious about fires in general. It never affected where I lived exactly, but it was always a presence during the really warm summers. It seems a little bit foreign living in the Midwest. It's not something that really crosses a lot of people's minds daily or even yearly with our rather moderate climate, except for this week. And especially having the Great Lakes as a freshwater source, sometimes I know I take that for granted, having that so close and so readily available. Also, this past summer, we went to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. There were multiple wildfires that we saw while we were there. So just because it doesn't impact this part of the country, it's still present in this country, as well as traveling international, where an entire culture is kind of based off of that and has had to adapt to it. Victoria is especially prone to bushfires because it's had a lot of droughts in its climate. So prolonged bouts of lower rainfall for that area. And one of the worst was the Millennium Drought, which actually started in the 90s and continued to about 2009. And it didn't end without leaving its lasting mark with the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, which were incredibly destructive. 173 people ended up dying from those. Hopefully, no. But this is a photo of one of the places we went to, Woods Point, right near there. This is a road sign. Unfortunately, I can't expand it, but just so it shows the damage. There's ash everywhere, and the road sign itself was melted in parts. During that fire, when it initially started, Melbourne reached a temperature of 114 degrees Celsius, so incredibly warm Fahrenheit. 36 degrees Celsius, that would have been a little bit too warm. And with some hot spots even getting to about 119. So whether you're in the city or in the rural areas where the fires did burn, people were affected. Constant water restrictions are in place, not so much in the winter times when they are getting a little bit more rain, but especially in the summers, and also days of permanent fire bans where nothing is allowed outside, no campfires, no electric stoves even. And it will only get worse with the predicted effects of climate change. More days over 35 degrees Celsius, which is about 96 degrees, will be yearly about 25, I think. 25 days up from about 9 in the upcoming decades, and also just an extreme reduction in the water stored in Victoria's reservoirs. So it's going to be incredibly hard-hitting to this area. And I'm particularly interested in the effects of climate change on a cultural level. So I decided to look at this state that I've have a really big personal connection to and see how it will adapt to keep some of its most beautiful and fascinating geologic sites. So the first park we went to was Organ Pipes National Park, or one of the first. It's one of the biggest drawbacks for this park, famous for its columnar basalt, as Ellie talked about and shown here. It's really close to suburbs. The suburbs start just across the highway that's right here. So there's that. And then also underneath this pop-up is the International Airport for Melbourne. So if a bushfire were to start here, it would be incredibly costly to a lot of infrastructure and the neighborhoods around it. It's only 20 minutes from downtown Melbourne. So it's the rain shadow that is produced from the Great Otway Mountains, which if this map extended, it would be further over to the east. And one of the driest parts of Victoria is from this town called Werribee, extending down this way. And in the scheme of things, Organ Pipes is not that far away from that really dry area, and neither is Melbourne. So like the threat I said, it's the combination of the costly damage that could happen and the fact that it already gets low amounts of rainfall. One of the biggest management techniques, about 50 years ago, this park was really depleted. Plants were not well maintained. It just was not a nice area, which is really unfortunate for such a great geologic site. But in 1975, a group created all these management plans to start restoring the native species of plants and also wildlife that live there. And since then, there have been volunteer groups that go through regularly and do controlled fires and kind of clean up the park, which helps with controlling bushfire threat, because with controlled fires, you get rid of unnecessary underbrush that could be really dangerous in dry and windy bouts of weather. So that really nice management means that in the future, this park is going to be more easily visitable. Especially because it's so close to the suburbs of Melbourne and Melbourne itself. You get a lot of school groups coming out here for a good educational experience that's really close to where they are, and also just local visitors looking for a beautiful park to walk in and around. Another park we went to was Hanging Rock State Park, like Ali talked about again. It's a little bit further from Melbourne, about an hour and a half. And it's basically this structure of stacked boulders from the extinct volcano that used to be there. And it has easily accessible trails that lead to the summit. And this is a picture of the summit looking down onto the rural land around it. And unfortunately, that rural land adds to the threat of this park, because there's a lot of space and less eyes monitoring that land versus Organ Pipes, where you have all those suburbs around, multiple fire departments. Everything's a little bit more spread out here. Also, since this is the summit of a mountain, basically, it's 100 meters above the plains around it, and fires burn more quickly uphill. So if one were to start and catch fire to the side of this mountain, it would easily spread uphill into the summit and burn off a lot of that vegetation and make it much more difficult for visitors to come back after that fire. This was one of the parks where I did get to talk to a ranger, and they use controlled fires to manage the park about once every fortnight, or also at their discretion. You need perfect conditions for a controlled fire, so things don't get out of hand. They have to closely watch weather reports for every day and every hour that they're doing these controlled burns. So if it's too windy or too dry or too hot, they won't be able to do it. So with increased predicted heat waves and droughts, they may not be able to do it every so often, but now at the average rate, they do it. The Department of Environment and Primary Industries has estimated an average of 584 fires every year, and only 8 of those come from out of controlled fires. So the techniques that they have are really safe and secure and are really productive for them to manage the bushfires. The future of this park, it may face more development around the immediate area surrounding the park. There's a big concert venue and horse racing track, so it does draw a lot of visitors to the immediate area, which also means that they'd be more interested in hiking up this mountain, which is incredibly accessible. And it'll just bring more investment to the area and more interest because you're already driving a little bit further out from Melbourne, so might as well see this beautiful park. Next site we went to is Trentham Falls, which is not too far from Hanging Rock. It's the highest single drop waterfall in Victoria, so that's kind of the biggest draw to this state park that it sits in. One of the biggest threats is that it reflects the availability of water. So in drought and during the summer months, it's not going to flow as greatly. And if you keep getting prolonged droughts and hotter weather, it may be completely dried up in the upcoming decades. So there's also natural erosion, as Ali talked about. You can see that it's cutting under the cliff that it sits on. So one of their biggest management techniques is that they only have one trail open to view the falls, which is where this photo is taken. That's the closest you can actually get to the falls, because the cliff is pretty fragile, and they want to cut down on the human-made erosion. If they were to lose this spectacular feature, like I said, they would lose a huge amount of the visitors they get every year who go just to see the falls. You would still get some regular hikers, but also it does sit on a forest preserve, so there's still the heightened threat of bushfires pretty often during the summer months. We also got to visit the beautiful town of Anglesea along the Great Ocean Road, which is a highway that stretches a few hundred miles along the southwest coast of Victoria. It's famous for its cliffs, and there's a ton of nice beaches. So in the summer times, it gets pretty crowded with tourists, both from Melbourne, who come down just for the weekends and have beach houses there, but also from international tourists. Just to give you an idea of the number of international tourists they get here along the Great Ocean Road, every so often they'll have signs that say, in Australia, we drive on the left, just as a friendly reminder that they are in a country where you do not drive on the typical side. So a lot of American tourists as well. But because this is such a big road and highway going along this route that connects a lot of different beach towns, it's going to be difficult if there has to be a major evacuation, because this area is not it's not safe from bushfires. In 1983, there was another big set of bushfires that pretty much completely destroyed Anglesea. And so while you think, oh, it's next to an ocean, there's a lot of land that is susceptible. And that 1983 fire actually got so out of control that firefighters had to let it burn until it hit the ocean and burned itself out because they could not get it under control. So the management techniques used here are basically educating visitors on water restrictions, that's something that they always have to be mindful of, and also the fire bans to make sure that no one's doing any dangerous activity and that may cause a larger dangerous fire. The future of this site is pretty good because there's high investment. It's such a big draw for the tourism industry, and it'll take a lot to keep visitors who want to go to the beach during hotter weather away. And that is the photo of the beach that we were at. It's very popular in the summer times, good surfing beach. So. We also visited the town of Marysville, which is a small mountain town, popular with summer vacationers, but also in the winter because it's near one of the only ski mountains near Melbourne. So should there be an off chance that there is a lot of snow in the wintertime, there just so happened to be when we went there, which we're a little disappointed at. They have great ski rental places, and it's just a quick 20-minute drive to the next ski mountain. It was heavily affected by the 2009 bushfires. The 90% of the town's buildings were completely decimated, and so that was kind of a rude awakening for the town that they knew they needed to implement a different set of planning for bushfires, because it's almost inevitable when you get this far up into the mountains surrounded by forests. There's so much that can be burned. They enacted strict new building codes, attributing something called the bushfire attack level to every new building that is built. So people who are looking to purchase buildings can see, is this going to withstand a bushfire? Hopefully also encouraging people to leave their homes and evacuate at the first sign of a bushfire if they feel that it might be more safe and may not burn down their entire lives that are situated in this house. Also, they have completely prohibited buildings and residing in certain areas that the government has identified as the highest risk of bushfires. So this is the visitor center in downtown Marysville, and it's aptly named the Phoenix Museum because it rose from the ashes. And it's really a great example of the rebuilding effort that was put into there, and they emphasized and wanted to ensure that tourism would stay strong for this little town, and that's exactly what they did. And they are now better prepared because of that reminder that they got that they are susceptible to bushfires, unfortunately. Also visited the town of Woods Point. which is an even smaller mountain town of about only 50 people throughout the year. But it's also really popular with holiday homes for families coming from Melbourne. It's about 3 hours east from Melbourne. So you get that extra response time that is needed for a bushfire that would start anywhere around the town because a lot of the aid and resources comes from Melbourne. There's only one fire station in Woods Point, which adds to its threat level. There was the 1939 bushfires that completely destroyed this kind of booming mining town, which was really unfortunate. It cut down the population. People didn't want to rebuild. So this is kind of the opposite of Marysville, but this happened in the 30s. One person did die in that fire. Many died in the fire surrounding it, but in Woods Point it was only one person, and that was actually the aunt of my great-grandmother. So I have a really big personal connection and family history to this town, and that's why we're able to visit it and why it's something that I grew up with, so I really wanted to look at it. They now have explicit mapping zones of fuel management zones. So all the forests around it, they're gum tree forests, they're going to be really heavily monitored during dry weather and pointing out the areas that are most at risk. They also, Woods Point is one of the last places to have an upkept refuge, which Allie had. This is actually an abandoned one. It used to be an old entrance to the mine. So that caption is wrong. But that's what it would look like. It's just this inlet into the side of a mountain and basically like a cave where it's fed by natural spring water, so the floor stays wet. And somewhere it said that 20-year-old blankets are kept in there, and if there was a bushfire, people would go in here, they would wet the blankets and hold it up against the entrance, so it would be a fire and smoke-proof door for the most part, or entranceway into here. And most of them are fed by natural vents coming from inside the mountains, so they would get a supply of fresh air should they need to be in there for a few hours. So the government is kind of cautious when it comes to upkeeping these because it's a huge liability. If something should go wrong, you have a lot of people kept in essentially a cave, but the locals have taken it upon themselves to upkeep their own refuge in town. There's also a difficulty getting to Woods Point if there are bushfires along the 3-hour route from Melbourne to Woods Point. So unfortunately, Woods Point is really at risk because it's such a small town surrounded by so much risk area. So the last point was the Melbourne Museum, which had an incredible forest gallery, is what they called it. It detailed the past bushfires in Victoria with photos, tree trunks that were the burned gum trees from the 2009 fires. And so a lot of things commemorating the past fires, but also explaining why they're necessary to Victoria's environment. The environment that we know today as Victoria has with all of its gum forests is because of bushfires. Every so often, centuries and even thousands of years, these fires come through and clear some of the growth and allow for the other native plants that are more common to grow through. Eucalyptus trees are they encourage fire because they have an oil in their leaves that are extremely flammable. So it kills out competitive species and allows these to thrive after the bushfires. They sprout really readily. One of the biggest things, though, learning from this gallery is that the population of Australia is going to continue to grow, which is going to be a huge issue as people try to spread out into these lands that have been affected by bushfires. And it's kind of inevitable that they will happen as the climate gets more dry. So ideally, overall, I would have liked to have talked to park rangers or just anyone at all of these sites, but that wasn't always the case. So I had to send out emails, which weren't responded, and I had to glean a lot of information from displays at the parks about what was going on bushfire-wise and that management. Also, just having an open mind, being able to alter your plans, because like Allie said, it took over a year of planning. And while it's nice to have that preparation, when you get to the trip, it cuts down the work you have to do there, it's also a little hard to change your mind into seeing how these unexpected things that would happen can benefit your project. We weren't planning on going to the Melbourne Museum at all, but we ended up spending 2 days there because we got free admission, and it was just incredibly beneficial for both our projects. So thank you for coming. If I could spend an extra week in the area, I probably would try to contact some people in the government positions that deal with bushfire management. The CFA, which is the Country Fire Authority, is one of the biggest bodies that you see present throughout there. And if I could have talked to some of them about more in-depth how they manage bushfires, like specifically in the suburbs and around Melbourne, I thought that would have been something that would have really benefited my project, but that's okay. I didn't get a chance to compare, I have to repeat the question, to compare the management here and in Australia. Like I said, it's really hard because I'm so far removed from where bushfires are an issue. But I think that would be a great future project that I'd be really interested in doing, because I am interested on seeing how it differs, whether it's the culture's ability to adapt or if it's something the government is doing, and if one way is better than the other. I'd be really interested in looking at that.
So is signage and sort of educational materials for the public pretty readily available, like for especially people who aren't from Australia and don't know about?
Yes, in every city they have a few boards on the side of the road that says what today's threat level is, and it's just like a little scale. And that's one of the biggest things that you saw every single day, and it wasn't something I paid attention to in the past. But those are really present in newspapers. There's ads for the CFA that it's kind of PSAs being like, conserve water, like, and it explains what they're doing, which it just has such a big presence there that as a tourist, I was able to pick them out. I don't know how much citizens there pay attention to it, because it's the way that they've learned to live their lives, that maybe it's something that they just recognize. Yep.
I have a question sort of related to Britt's about, in the US we went through this only you can prevent forest fires idea, where the goal was no forest fires at all,
Mm-hmm.
and then a recognition of the utility of them and the ecology of the system. Did Australia go through a similar thing, or have they always thought of the importance of these bushfires in management?
Right, I think a lot of them, I think controlled fires happen often enough that it doesn't really have the stigma that they have here, where people are like, you're burning land, like why? I feel like they have an understanding, because these bad bushfires happen yearly, that it's not so detrimental when they do see controlled fires happening. I guess they're used to it is the best way to put it. It's just their livelihoods and how they've adapted.
One of the complicating factors in western U.S. has been the beetles that are devastating large areas, which then make them much more prone to fires. And that probably will be affected by climate change as well. Is there an analogous set of problems with gum trees there that we have with pines here?
If gum trees have a similar problem, it's not something that I know of. I don't know anything about invasive species or anything really about the wildlife. So there may be. I know a lot of the species that they do have there have adapted pretty well. And so far that hasn't been an issue. Maybe if bushfires continue to be an issue, then maybe you might see some relationship between species coming in and making that more prominent. Not that I know of.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.